When it comes to wealth and income, people tend to compare themselves to the people they see around them rather than those who live on the other side of the world. Yet, when thinking about inequality, it also makes sense to approach the world as a single community. When looking at the world through this lens, some notable trends stand out regarding class, country, and gender inequality. First, we need to discuss what inequality is. Equity is considered the promotion of equal life chances so that people face a level playing field in society. Equality means that social regulations are not marked by structural stratification of opportunity that accords some persons an inbuilt advantage over others. In other words, to have an entirely just society, we would need to move from a situation of hierarchical poles to one of inclusive circles. Historically, arbitrary privilege has arisen in social relations, including class, caste, country, gender, race, urban and rural divides, sexual orientation, disability, and age bases. People born into some socioeconomic circles have generally had fewer life chances than others. Equality does not require that social categories be eliminated and that all people become the same. However, it is manifestly equitable when an embedded stratification of social positions largely determines whether people gain access to the resources they need to develop their capacities. Social equity has positive repercussions, including more peace, sufficient care for environment, good public health, poverty eradication, adequate labor protection, enhanced identity and knowledge, and social cohesion. Proponents of globalization have promised enhanced opportunities for all, while critics have decried intensified subordinations. The expansion of global relations would be more sustainable to the extent that people perceive a fair distribution of chances to benefit from the process. Statistical links can be drawn between globalization and trends in inequality, but the correlations do not necessarily indicate causal significance. Some developments in contemporary globalization have worked against structurally imposed hindrances on people. Resultingly, global relations have widened resource gaps and reinforced social hierarchies, especially those related to class, country, and urban and rural divides. The growth of global relations has not surprisingly unsettled many. Neoliberalism globalization has not been the sole cause of persistent and growing violences of inequality in today's world. However, the rise of transplanetary connectivity has contributed to these trends in at least 4 ways. Contemporary global capitalism has often undermined the redistributive mechanisms that were built up through many states during the first 3/4 of the 20th century. Third, global regimens, rules, and institutions have tended to underwrite allocations of benefits and harms that favor the already advantaged. Lastly, contemporary globalization has substantially undermined the capacity of traditional, territorial-based social movements like trade unionism and anti-colonialism to campaign for a fair distribution of life changes. Social inequity is no more intrinsic to global than it is to territorial geography. Structural hierarchies between social groups have persisted and grown in the context of contemporary globalization. These trends have mainly resulted from laissez-faire policies and are not inherent in globalization itself.
There are ties between country and inequalities and the rise of globalization as well. The modern world has unfair discriminated against the South or third world countries and the East and second world countries in favor of the North, the developed first world. People living in lands whose governments are members of the G7, OECD, and NATO have generally held structures and advantages over inhabitants of countries that have lain outside such clubs. The average person born in the South has had fewer life changes than a person born in the North due to resource distribution, laws, institutions, and inherited prejudice. However, these inequalities resulted from the policies that have been adopted in respect of global spaces rather from globality. The welfare gap between the South and the North has grown during the contemporary period of accelerated globalization, yet many populations in both countries have experienced various improvements in material conditions during these decades. But the advantages in the North have always been greater. Access to global spaces, pre-existent stratification, has meant that disadvantaged countries have been less able to share in the gains of global relations. The digital divide between the North and the South has impacted availability of internet and the security of the web. Additionally, trans-world products account for 80% of the North world market, and US, European, Japanese currencies dominated global transactions. Very accelerated globalization has had unhappy consequences for the distribution of human life changes between countries. The dismal trend and injustice between countries has not been inherited in globalization. Stronger social movements and alternative regulatory arrangements could yield more outcomes.
One of the most significant ties of inequality to globalization is class inequality. Class is the division of a population in respect of different roles in the production process. Class diversification is accepted but unjust when class categories generate unequal life chances. While rewarding certain forms of work can drive the company and create demand, some premiums are excessive and restrict social mobility, education opportunities, access to health care. Class difference can lead to class hierarchy. Critics have alleged that contemporary globalization has intensified class inequalities, but class inequalities existed long before the current phase of accelerated globalization. Class gaps are, however, continuing to increase alongside globalization. Income gaps on a planetary scale have also been greater than inequalities within countries. This is tied with wages being associated with jobs that require more education and training. In the East and South countries, an early transition from state socialism to market capitalism experienced a steep ascent to wealth for a few and rapid descent for poverty for many. At the start of the 21st century, 7.7 million super rich each held more than 1 million in financial assets, with 2.8 billion others lived on less than $2 a day. The alternative of private education has been available only to wealthy households, resulting in class-based inequalities in educational opportunities. Additionally, deterioration of public health, housing, and transportation impacts disadvantages classes. Globalization has figured in the contemporary growth of class equalities. However, this outcome is not inherent in trans-world social relations. The problem is not global yet, but the neoliberal problem is not global yet, but the thinkers have pursued stabilization, liberalization, deregulation, privatization, and fiscal constraint without specific attention to issues of class justice. Free global markets do not mean open to all. Trans-world expansion has generated surplus, but different classes have different opportunities to tap the accumulation. Fiscal austerity to improve global competitiveness has meant reduction in the amount and quality of state-provided education, housing, nutrition, health, and insurance. Neoliberalism, globalization has eroded the protective shield of the redistributive state. While globalization is not likely the cause of class inequality, it is difficult to demonstrate how the new global capitalism can function to the benefit of the majority and not only for corporate managers and investors.
Critics have alleged that the trend has perpetuated the structural subordination of women to men. Just as certain individuals from underprivileged classes have beaten the odds, so have certain women overcome gender obstacles to become leading managers, politicians, and professionals. The patriarchy has a long history and became embedded in most social contexts across the world before the proliferation of transplanetary connections in the past half-century. Researchers have only recently begun systemically to assemble gender social data, so there is limited historical data. Some significant reductions have occurred since 1970 in gender gaps with respect to accessing health and education services. Many of these changes are due to the feminist movement of the 1970s getting many official changes made. In 1971, Reed v. Reed declared sex discrimination a violation of the 14th Amendment. 2 years later, in the United States, Roe v. Wade happened, and the women's movement continued to make positive changes around the world. This movement saw success in some places and backlash in others. Participation in wage labor increased from 48% in 1973 to 60% in 1990, and many other positive improvements have been made. For example, the amount of girls enrolled in secondary school increased from 36% in 1990 to 79% in 2000. According to the World Bank, the ratio of women and men attending secondary school in the United States is roughly 1-to-1. Other examples of the positive impact contemporary globalization has had on women is women's role in the workforce has increased. For example, the amount of women working in EPZs in the South rose from 1.3 million in 1986 to 4 million in 1994. However, it came into question how much of a role globalization has actually had in these changes and if these changes are actually improvements. One frequently pointed out example is that men often take the high salary positions where women take the clerical work. Global finance has similarly seen an exclusion of women from credit markets relative to men. In the late 1990s, the internet was another segment that was dominated by male users. In the most extreme situations, women only made up 4% of internet users in some Arab countries. It is also hard to prove that globalization is responsible for the amount of women enrolled in secondary school. It can be hard to directly correlate globalization to changes in the way women are viewed in different societies. As with everything in globalization, there has always been opposite trends. In Bangladesh, increased trade has decreased the wage gap between men and women, where in Zambia, it increased the wage gap between men and women. One country that has seen a major reversal in women's rights since the 70s is Iran, mostly due to the Iranian Revolution. After the revolution in 1979, more laws were put in place requiring mandatory veiling and dress codes for women. The Islamic Revolution is often seen as a revolution that happened because of a rejection of Westernization and one culture seeing American trends in their society and disagreeing with them. Globalization has contributed to inequalities around the world. It is not the primary cause.